Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson with Chapter 20, Do Unions Really Raise Wages? As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, we're doing this series as a parallel read with Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies, that is correct. So I'll post a link to that series so you can follow along there as well. As I've also mentioned throughout the course of this read, we'll be doing an analysis and the review at the end of each chapter. So put a timestamp in this video's description so you can jump straight to the analysis and review if that's how you'd like to go about things. Also, as I've mentioned throughout this particular series, Hazlitt breaks this chapter up into several reads. He labels these parts purely numerically, and as we've mentioned throughout the course of this read too a few times, since he doesn't put in a label for part 1, I'll have to insert a part 1 after we read the chapter title. And one final thing before we go, yes, folks, I am on vacation, so I'm doing this on the road, so you'll have to excuse any technical difficulties that arise as a result of that. So forgive me on that one, folks. So without further ado, let's dive into tonight's read, which is Chapter 20, Do Unions Really Raise Wages? Part 1. The belief that labor unions can substantially raise real wages over the long run and for the whole working population is one of the greatest delusions of the present age. This delusion is mainly the result of failure to recognize that wages are basically determined by labor productivity. It is for this reason, for example, that wages in the United States were incomparably higher than wages in England and Germany, all during the decades when the quote-unquote labor movement in the latter two countries was far more advanced. In spite of the overwhelming evidence that labor productivity is the fundamental determinant of wages, the conclusion is usually forgotten or derided by labor union leaders, and by that large group of economic writers who seek a reputation as quote-unquote liberals by parroting them. But this conclusion does not rest on the assumption, as they suppose, that employers are uniformly kind and generous men, eager to do what is right. It rests on the very different assumption that the individual employer is eager to increase his own profits to the maximum. If people are willing to work for less than they are really worth to him, why should he not take the fullest advantage of this? Why should he not prefer, for example, to make $1 a week out of a workman, rather than see some other employer make $2 a week out of him? And as long as this situation exists, there will be a tendency for employers to bid workers up to their full economic worth. All this does not mean that unions can serve no useful or legitimate function. The central function they can serve is to improve local working conditions and to assure that all of their members get the true market value of their services. For the competition of workers for jobs and of employers for workers does not work perfectly. Neither individual workers nor individual employers are likely to be fully informed concerning the conditions of the labor market. An individual worker may not know the true market value of the services to an employer, and he may be in a weak bargaining position. Mistakes of judgment are far more costly to him than to an employer. If an employer mistakenly refuses to hire a man from whose services he might have profited, he merely loses the net profit he might have made from employing that one man, and he may employ 100 or 1,000 men. But if a worker mistakenly refuses a job in the belief that he can easily get another that will pay him more, the error may cost him dear. His whole means of livelihood is involved. Not only may he fail to find promptly another job offering more, he may fail for a time to find another job offering remotely as much. And time may be the essence of his problem, because he and his family must eat. So he may be tempted to take a wage that he believes to be below his quote-unquote real worth, rather than face these risks. When an employer's workers deal with him as a body, however, and set a known quote-unquote standard wage for a given class of work, they may help to equalize bargaining power and the risks involved in mistakes. But it is easy, as experience has proved, for unions, particularly with the help of one-sided labor legislation, which puts compulsion solely on employers, to go beyond their legitimate functions, to act irresponsibly, and to embrace short-sighted and antisocial policies. They do this, for example, whenever they seek to fix the wages of their members above their real market worth. Such an attempt always brings about unemployment. The arrangement can be made to stick, in fact, only by some form of intimidation or coercion. One device consists in restricting the membership of the union on some other basis than that of proved competence or skill. This restriction may take many forms. It may consist in charging new workers excessive initiation fees, in arbitrary membership qualifications, in discrimination, open or concealed on grounds of religion, race, or sex, in some absolute limitation on the number of members, or an exclusion by force if necessary, not only of the products of non-union labor, but of the products even of affiliated unions in other states or cities. The most obvious case in which intimidation and force are used to put or keep the wages of a particular union above the real market worth of its members' services is that of a strike. A peaceful strike is possible. To the extent that it remains peaceful, it is a legitimate labor weapon, even though it is one that should be used rarely and as a last resort. If his workers as a body withhold their labor, they may bring a stubborn employer who has been underpaying them to his senses. He may find that he is unable to replace these workers with workers equally good who are willing to accept the wage that the former have now rejected. But the moment workers have to use intimidation or violence to enforce their demands, the moment they use mass picketing to prevent any of the old workers from continuing at their jobs, or to prevent the employer from hiring new permanent workers to take their places, the case becomes suspect. For the pickets are really being used not primarily against the employer, but against other workers. These other workers are willing to take the jobs that the old employees have vacated, and at the wages that the old employees now reject. The fact proves that the other alternatives open to the new workers are not as good as those that the old employees have refused. If, therefore, the old employees succeed by force in preventing new workers from taking their place, they prevent these new workers from choosing the best alternative open to them, and force them to take something worse. The strikers are therefore insisting on a position of privilege, and are using force to maintain this privileged position against other workers. If the foregoing analysis is correct, the indiscriminate hatred of the quote-unquote strikebreaker is not justified. If the strikebreakers consist merely of professional thugs who themselves threaten violence, or who cannot in fact do the work, or if they are being paid a temporarily higher rate solely for the purpose of making a pretense of carrying on until the old workers are frightened back to work at the old rates, the hatred may be warranted. But if they are in fact merely men and women who are looking for permanent jobs and willing to accept them at the old rate, then they are workers who would be shoved into worse jobs than these in order to enable the striking workers to enjoy better ones. And this superior position for the old employees could continue to be maintained, in fact, only by the ever-present threat of force. Part 2. Emotional economics has given birth to theories that calm examination cannot justify. One of these is the idea that labor is being quote-unquote underpaid generally. This would be analogous to the notion that in a free market, prices in general are chronically too low. Another curious but persistent notion is that the interests of a nation's workers are identical with each other, and that an increase in wages for one union in some obscure way helps all other workers. Not only is there no truth in this idea, the truth is that if a particular union by coercion is able to enforce for its own members a wage substantially above the real market worth of their services, it will hurt all other workers as it hurts other members of the community. In order to see more clearly how this works, let us imagine a community in which the facts are enormously simplified arithmetically. Suppose the community consisted of just half a dozen groups of workers, and that these groups were originally equal to each other in their total wages and the market value of their product. Let us say that these six groups of workers consist of 1. Farmhands, 2. Retail store workers, 3. Workers in the clothing trades, 4. Coal miners, 5. building workers and 6 railway employees. Their wage rates, determined without any element of coercion, are not necessarily equal, but whatever they are, let us assign to each of them an original index number of 100 as a base. Now let us suppose that each group forms a national union and is able to enforce its demands in proportion not merely to its economic productivity, but to its political power and strategic position. Suppose the result is that the farmhands are unable to raise their wages at all, that the retail store workers are able to get an increase of 10%, the clothing workers of 20%, the coal miners of 30%, the building trades of 40%, and the railroad employees of 50%. On the assumptions we have made, this will mean that there has been an average increase in wages of 25%. Now suppose again, for the sake of arithmetical simplicity, that the price of the product that each group of workers makes rises by the same percentage as the increase in that group's wages. For several reasons, including the fact that labor costs do not represent all costs, the price will not quite do that, certainly not in any short period, but the figures will nonetheless serve to illustrate the basic principle involved. We shall then have a situation in which the cost of living has risen by an average of 25%. The farmhands, though they have no reduction in their money wages, will be considerably worse off in terms of what they can buy. The retail store workers, even though they have got an increase in money wages of 10%, will be worse off than before the race began. Even the workers in the clothing trades, with a money wage increase of 20%, will be at a disadvantage compared with their previous position. The coal miners, with a money wage increase of 30%, will have made in purchasing power only a slight gain. The building and railroad workers will of course have made a gain, but one much smaller in actuality than in appearance. But even such calculations rest on the assumption that the forced increase in wages has brought about no unemployment. This is likely to be true only if the increase in wages has been accompanied by an equivalent increase in money and bank credit. And even then it is improbable that such distortions in wage rates can be brought about without creating areas of unemployment, particularly in the trades in which wages have advanced the most. If this corresponding monetary inflation does not occur, the forced wage advances will bring about widespread unemployment. The unemployment need not necessarily be greatest, in percentage terms, among the unions whose wages have been advanced the most. For unemployment will be shifted and distributed in relation to the relative elasticity of the demand for different kinds of labor and in relation to the quote-unquote joint nature of the demand for many kinds of labor. Yet when all these allowances have been made, even the groups whose wages have been advanced the most will probably be found, when their unemployed are averaged with their employed members, to be worse off than before. And in terms of welfare, of course, the loss suffered will be much greater than the loss in merely arithmetical terms, because the psychological losses of those who are unemployed will greatly outweigh the psychological gains of those with a slightly higher income in terms of purchasing power. Nor can the situation be rectified by providing unemployment relief. Such relief, in the first place, is paid for in large part, directly or indirectly, out of the wages of those who work. It therefore reduces these wages. Quote-unquote adequate relief payments, moreover, as we have already seen, create unemployment. They do so in several ways. When strong labor unions in the past made it their function to provide for their own unemployed members, they thought twice before demanding a wage that would cause heavy unemployment. But where there is a relief system under which the general taxpayer is forced to provide the unemployment caused by excessive wage rates, this restraint on excessive union demands is removed. Moreover, as we've already noted, quote-unquote adequate relief will cause some men not to seek work at all, and will cause others to consider that they are in effect being asked to work not for the wage offered, but only for the difference between that wage and the relief payment. And heavy unemployment means that fewer goods are produced, that the nation is poorer, and that there is less for everybody. The apostles of salvation by unionism sometimes attempt another answer to the problem I have just presented. It may be true, they will admit, that the members of strong unions today exploit, among others, the non-unionized workers, but the remedy is simple. Unionize everybody. The remedy, however, is not quite that simple. In the first place, in spite of the enormous legal and political encouragements, one might in some cases say compulsions, to unionization under the Wagner-Taft-Hartley Act and other laws, it is not an accident that only about a fourth of this nation's gainfully employed workers are unionized. The conditions propitious to unionization are much more special than generally recognized. But even if universal unionization could be achieved, the unions could not possibly be equally powerful any more than they are today. Some groups of workers are in a far better strategic position than others, either because of greater numbers, of the more essential nature of the product they make, of the greater dependence on their industry of other industries, or of their greater ability to use coercive methods. But suppose this were not so. Suppose, in spite of the self-contradictoriness of the assumption that all workers by coercive methods could raise their money wages by an equal percentage, nobody would be any better off in the long run than if wages had not been raised at all. Part 3. This leads us to the heart of the question. It is usually assumed that an increase in wages is gained at the expense of the profits of employers. This may of course happen for short periods or in special circumstances. If wages are forced up in a particular firm, in such competition with others that it cannot raise its prices, the increase will come out of its profits. This is likely to happen if the wage increase takes place throughout a whole industry. If the industry does not face foreign competition, it may be able to increase its prices and pass the wage increase along to consumers. As these are likely to consist for the most part of workers, they will simply have their real wages reduced by having to pay more for a particular product. It is true that as a result of the increased prices, sales of that industry's product may fall off, so that volume of profits in the industry will be reduced, but employment and total payrolls in the industry are likely to be reduced by a corresponding amount. It is possible, no doubt, to conceive of a case in which the profits in a whole industry are reduced without any corresponding reduction in employment. A case, in other words, in which an increase in wage rates means a corresponding increase in payrolls, and in which the whole cost comes out of the industry's profits without throwing any firm out of business. Such a result is not likely, but it is conceivable. Suppose we take an industry like that of the railroads, for example, which cannot always pass increased wages along to the public in the form of higher rates, because government regulation will not permit it. It is at least possible for unions to make their gains in the short run at the expense of employers and investors. The investors once had liquid funds, but they have put them, say, into the railroad business. They have turned them into rails and road beds, freight cars, and locomotives. Once their capital might have been turned into any of 1,000 forms, but today it is trapped, so to speak, in one specific form. The railway unions may force them to accept smaller returns in this capital already invested. It will pay the investors to continue running the railroad if they can earn anything at all above operating expenses, even if it is only 0.1% on their investment. But there is an inevitable corollary of this. If the money that they have invested in railroads now yields less than money they can invest in other lines, the investors will not put a cent more into railroads. They may replace a few of the things that wear out first to protect the small yield on their remaining capital, but in the long run, they will not even bother to replace items that fall into obsolescence or decay. If capital invested at home pays them less than that invested abroad, they will invest abroad. If they cannot find sufficient return anywhere to compensate them for their risk, they will cease to invest at all. Thus, the exploitation of capital by labor can at best be merely temporary. It will quickly come to an end. It will come to an end, actually, not so much in the way indicated in our hypothetical illustration as by the forcing of marginal firms out of business entirely, the growth of unemployment, and the forced readjustment of wages and profits to the point where the prospect of normal or abnormal profits leads to a resumption of employment and production. But in the meanwhile, as a result of the exploitation, unemployment and reduced production will have made everybody poorer. Even though labor for a time will have a greater relative share of the national income will fall absolutely, so that labor's relative gains in these short periods may mean a Pyrrhic victory. They may mean that labor, too, is getting a lower total amount in terms of real purchasing power. Part 4. Thus we are driven to the conclusion that unions, though they may for a time be able to secure an increase in money wages for their members, partly at the expense of employers and more at the expense of non-unionized workers, cannot, in the long run, and for the whole body of workers, increase real wages at all. The belief that they do so rests on a series of delusions. One of these is the fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc, which sees the enormous rise in wages in the last half-century due principally to the growth of capital investment and to scientific technological advance, and ascribes it to the unions because the unions were also growing during this period. But the error most responsible for the delusion is that of considering merely what a rise of wages brought about by union demands means in the short run for the particular workers who retain their jobs, while failing to trace the efforts of this advance on employment, production, and the living costs of all workers, including those who forced the increase. One may go further than this conclusion and raise the question whether unions have not, in the long run and for the whole body of workers, actually prevented real wages from rising to the extent to which they otherwise may have risen. They have certainly been a force working to hold down or to reduce wages if their effect on that balance has been to reduce labor productivity, and we may ask whether it has not been so. With regard to productivity, there is something to be said for union policies, it is true, on the credit side. In some trades, they have insisted on standards to increase the level of skill and competence, and in their early history they did much to protect the health of their members. Where labor was plentiful, individual employers often stood to make short-run gains by speeding up workers and working them long hours in spite of ultimate ill effects upon their health, because they could easily be replaced with others. And sometimes ignorant or short-sighted employers might even reduce their own profits by overworking their employees. In all these cases, the unions, by demanding decent standards, often increased the health and broader welfare of their members at the same time as they increased their real wages. But in recent years, as their power has grown, and as much misdirected public sympathy has led to a tolerance or endorsement of antisocial practices, unions have gone beyond their legitimate goals. It was a gain not only to health and welfare, but even in the long run to production to reduce a 70-hour week to a 60-hour week. It was a gain to health and leisure to reduce a 60-hour week to a 48-hour week. It was a gain to leisure, but not necessarily to production and income, to reduce a 48-hour week to a 40-hour week. The value to health and leisure of reducing the working week to 40 hours is much less, the reduction in output and income more clear. But the unions now talk about, and sometimes enforce, 35 and 30-hour weeks, and deny that these can or need reduce output or income. But it is not only in reducing scheduled working hours that the union policy has worked against productivity. That, in fact, is one of the least harmful ways in which it has done so, for the compensating gain, at least, has been clear. But many unions have insisted on rigid subdivisions of labor, which have raised production costs and led to expensive and ridiculous quote-unquote jurisdictional disputes. They've opposed payment on the basis of output or efficiency, and insisted on the same hourly rates for all their members regardless of differences in productivity. They have insisted on promotion for seniority rather than for merit. They have initiated deliberate slowdowns under the pretense of fighting quote-unquote speed-ups. They have denounced, insisted upon the dismissal of, and sometimes cruelly beaten, men who turned out more work than their fellows. They have opposed the introduction or improvement of machinery. They have insisted that if any of their members have been laid off because of the installation of more efficient or more labor-saving machinery, the laid-off workers receive quote-unquote guaranteed incomes indefinitely. They've insisted on make-work rules to require more people or more time to perform a given task. They have insisted, with the threat of ruining employers, on the hiring of people who are not needed at all. Most of these policies have been followed under the assumption that there is just a fixed amount of work to be done, a definite quote-unquote job fund, which has to be spread over as many people and hours as possible so as not to use it up too soon. This assumption is utterly false. There is actually no limit to the amount of work to be done. Work creates work. What A produces constitutes the demand for what B produces. But because this false assumption exists, and because the policies of unions are based on it, their net effect has been to reduce productivity below what it would otherwise have been. Their net effect, therefore, in the long run, and for all groups of workers, has been to reduce real wages, that is, wages in terms of the goods they will buy, below the level to which they would otherwise have risen. The real cause for the tremendous increase in real wages in the last century has been, to repeat, the accumulation of capital and the enormous technological advance made possible by it. But this process is not automatic. As a result not only of bad union, but of bad governmental policies, it has, in fact, in the last decade, come to a halt. If we look only at the average of gross weekly earnings of private non-agricultural workers in terms of paper dollars, it is true that they have risen from $107.73 in 1968 to $189.36 in August 1977. But when the Bureau of Labor Statistics allows for inflation, when it translates these earnings into 1967 dollars to take account of the increase in consumer prices, it finds that real weekly earnings actually fell from $103.39 in 1968 to $103.36 in August 1977. This halt in the rise of real wages has not been a consequence inherent in the nature of unions. It has been the result of short-sighted union and government policies. There is still time to change both of them. All right, that concludes tonight's read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So we have to start off this video with a conversation about gaslighting, because that has what has been done eternally on the supply side economics, or the right wing, if you will, or the libertarian take on unions, basically since their inception, and I'm sure you guys have heard some of this. In this case, Hazlitt makes it explicit that he does believe that there is a role for unions. He does this on page 141. All this does not mean that unions can serve no useful or legitimate function. The central function they serve is to improve local working conditions and to assure that all of their members get the true market value of their services. He does it again on page 142. A peaceful strike is possible. To the extent that it remains peaceful, it is a legitimate labor weapon, even though it is one that should be used rarely and as a last resort. And then he devotes an entire paragraph to lauding certain efforts of unions on page 149, the part that starts with regard to productivity, there is something to be said for union policies. It is true on the credit side. However, I think the argument he's making in this chapter is simply the argument that when the pendulum swings too far in favor of one thing during a negotiation, then that thing can pose problems in that negotiation setting. So the true purpose for unions, more than anything else, is to create an element of leverage at a negotiation table. And as Hazlitt mentions, that leverage is only legitimate so long as it remains peaceful, and so long as we are still talking about, and he doesn't say this explicitly, but it's implied here, as long as we are still talking about a mutually consensual transaction between what we know to be adults, and the reason we say adults is because we assume that children cannot consent. This is This is a point that he makes on page 142. Excuse me. If his workers, referring to an employer, if his workers as a body withhold their labor, they may bring a stubborn employer who has been underemploying him to his senses. He may find that he is unable to replace these workers with workers equally good who are willing to accept the wages that the former have now rejected. But the moment workers have to use intimidation or violence to enforce their demands, their case becomes suspect. For the pickets are really being used not primarily against the employer, but against other workers. So in this case, he not only says that all he's basically doing is making a when the pendulum swings too far argument, and that in this chapter he's basically going to show that the pendulum has swung too far. And the reason for that is through the use of intimidation and coercion, which are not elements of an actual free market. And in a free market, as the Chicago School has said previously, what you are free from is interference. And what we mean by interference is interference with mutually consensual transactions. And that could come from intimidation, coercion, force, threats of force, etc. He makes that point when referring to strike breakers on page 143. And the superior position for the old employees could continue to be maintained, in fact, only by the ever-present threat of force. So that's where he's talking about strikebreakers. So strikebreakers, the derision against strikebreakers may be justified if the strikebreakers are using intimidation or force. However, if the strikebreakers are merely just people that are willing to work for the wages, the exact wages that the previous employees were not willing to work, well, tough luck. You really don't have any, right to complain at that point. You should have accepted that wage. So in that case, we're dealing with a situation where we basically have a market value of the wage, and the union is in this case striking to try to achieve a wage above market, the market wage. So in this case, what you'd have is a situation where if we're going to have a truly, purely mutually consensual transaction, then the derision is against the strikebreakers, the scabs, if you will, who cross the picket line and start working. It's misplaced. In this case, what happened was the previous employees overestimated their value on the market and made a mistake in leaving their work. All of this can be chalked up to so as far as where the pendulum swings and all of the faults of union, all of the faults of the universal lauding of unions and the condemnation of employers and strikebreakers is all based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what money and money wages represent. We've talked about this a lot. The money and the money wages represent the productivity, the product output. This is a point Hazlitt makes on page 140. In spite of the overwhelming evidence that labor productivity is the fundamental determinant of wages, the conclusion is usually forgotten. Excuse me, this is the wrong quote. But this conclusion does not rest on the assumption, as they suppose, that employers are uniformly kind. Oh, excuse me. Sorry. So I actually did this right initially. This is all based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what money and money wages represent, which is, of course, the product output. In spite of the overwhelming evidence that labor productivity is the fundamental determinant of wages, the conclusion is usually forgotten or derided by labor union leaders and by that large group of economic writers who seek a reputation as quote-unquote liberals by parroting them. And of course, then in comes the gaslighting. I've already explained what Hazlitt means by this. Hazlitt has already said there is a place for unions. Hazlitt is saying that the question of whether or not unions have been a good thing so far over the whole of their existence in general is a question that is a testable hypothesis, and in his case he's going to provide evidence that that's not the case, or provide at least some sort of proof that that's not the case. The gaslighting comes in and how the opposition has described this position, but this conclusion does not rest on the assumption, as they suppose, that employers are uniformly kind and generous men eager to do what is right. So in this case, of course, we're not treating on the supply side economic side of things, we're not treating the employer as some sort of angel fighting against the forces of the demons of their employees. We're not saying that there is always an altruistic motivation for employers. What we're saying is that they're obviously going to work in terms of a utility. And if by reducing the workers' working hours, which we'll get into in a minute, we can actually increase productivity in the long run, that would be something where an employer who's short-sighted might not see that, but a union might be what's necessary in order to increase that leverage at the bargaining table to get that working week reduced. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But first I want to start with a conversation about part two. Part two, Hazlitt introduces what I think is a really bad hypothetical. I think it's a needlessly drawn out hypothetical that it's just a bad analog for illustrating the point he's trying to make, which is a point that we've covered quite extensively in chapter 19. So go ahead and just, if you didn't see the analysis and review, I'll put a link in this video's description that'll jump you straight to the analysis and review from chapter 19. We also covered a lot of this in a video I did on my other channel about the law of demand and how that causes unemployment. So honestly, I would say that if you're having trouble with part two, just go to those two videos where I go into much more extensive detail on this matter. And I think I explain it in a much simpler version. The whole point of the illustration that he's trying to make with the sectors, the 6 sectors, and the fact that he's going to start them off as an index number of 100 as a base. What he's trying to illustrate is that on average, if all of the sectors have an increase in wages as a result of what he describes of 25%, it may not be that everyone's a winner in this case, because it may be that in the case of some sectors, not everyone gets that 25%, but prices will fairly uniformly increase on everybody's demand by 25% in response to all of this, which we talked about again in chapter 19, and which we've talked about in other videos before. The example he offers, however, is needlessly complicated and confusing. I would say that the short version is to just remember that a forced overpayment for a good or service must result in a shortage for that good or service, increased prices, both, or much more widespread shortages in other sectors. Shortages in this case, because we're talking about labor, means unemployment. And again, I put a link to this. I put a link in this video's description to that video I talked about, where I talked about the law of demand and how that causes unemployment, how things like minimum wages cause unemployment. Part three, he makes a reference to sticking it to capital. So this is actually really, really bad, and that might have gotten confusing as well. The short version of what he's talking about when the pro-union side, if you will, it says that a role of union is to basically stick it to capital. This is really bad. This is actually much worse than what we talked about when it comes to viewing things in terms of the relationship between employer and employee. In this case, we're looking at the relationship between capital and labor, which is a little bit different. But the short version is when you lower profits, when you force profits to come down in a way that's not a reflection of market influences like supply and demand, the decrease in profits in that sector, or even in just that business, means less investment, which means much less productivity in the long run in that sector. And that means that because you have the decreased productivity, everyone becomes poorer. And we know that because, like I've said a million times, money represents nothing other than the productivity that it has been created by. Right? Money is just a medium of exchange. Currency is just a medium of exchange. And if the thing that you can get in exchange for it, in this case, the labor, it becomes less productive, then the money itself winds up representing less. This is where you get inflation. In part 4, he mentions the phrase post hoc ergo propter hoc. So we're going to briefly just go over what that means, because that could get confusing. This is, in common parlance today, very often shorted to just a post hoc. So in this case, the short version, if you're going to go to Wikipedia and just look it up, is that B chronologically followed A, therefore A caused B. A happened, then B happened, therefore A caused B. So the most common way we see this is not quite so direct as what I just described. It's more of something like an aha, see, this happened. So therefore, aha, see, this happened. So this proves that this was caused by the theory I posited. So in this case, you often see a rejection of alternative hypotheses. In this case, you often see a rejection of independent variable control. And instead, you're kind of working logically backwards, assuming the claim is true and finding things to quote-unquote evidence the claim without actually testing the hypothesis. Sowell would call this assuming a hypothesis is true axiomatically, rather than that the claim being made is a testable hypothesis and actually subjecting the hypothesis to the scientific method. So in this case, again, we are assuming the thing is true and we're finding evidence after the fact and in this case, after the fact that we have assumed the thing is true. There are other things that are related to this. For example, when we'll just stick with that because we're getting on the long side here. So on pages 149 to 150, he talks about how one of the legitimate roles that unions have served in the short run was to, in some cases, reduce hours. So in this case, this is not the businesses engaging in altruism. This is not something that is necessarily an axiomatic good. This is not something that is a necessary good. This is something that was good because at net balance it increased productivity. This is something that was good because employers were incredibly short-sighted and didn't see that if you're working somebody to the absolute bone, there's a certain limit to how productive they're going to wind up being. So again, this is not an element of altruism. This is an element of utilitarianism. So this is a good thing because it serves a certain portion of utility. It serves a utilitarian goal and a utilitarian end. So in this case, we're talking about non-exhausted workers becoming more productive. So you can almost imagine a curve. I'll do this for you guys. A curve, right? And there's a point at which, like up here, where that's where you're going to maximize productivity. And if you have the axes of, say, productivity versus the number of hours worked. So if the number of hours worked goes, let's say I got to do this for you guys. So if the number of hours worked is way the heck over here, and we decrease it a little, we may get greater productivity. And the reason for that will be, of course, if you're exhausted, you're not going to be as productive as if you weren't exhausted. But then as we decrease even further, we're going to wind up decreasing productivity. This is true, of course, to a point that we can reduce hours and increase productivity. In the same way that the Laffer curve is 100% true of taxation, that you may have a super duper high tax rate, and as you lower the tax rate, you get more productivity, therefore you wind up collecting more total taxes. So in this case, if this is true, and if this is a laudable effort of the unions in the short run, of course, in that particular instance, then yes, obviously you're making the exact same point for the Laffer curve being true. So excuse the hot takes, folks. So that actually concludes everything that we should need to be going over from this chapter, all the stuff that I thought wasn't fairly self-explanatory. It was kind of on the long side, so I didn't want to get into absolutely everything. So in our next read, we'll be in our next read in Economics in One Lesson, we'll be continuing with Chapter 21, which is entitled, quote-unquote, Enough to Buy Back the Product. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.